What's good, y'all? This is SA, and for years I've been developing a turn-based role-playing game called Guardians of RPG. Yes, I know how the title sounds, just hear me out for a second. In this game, you wake up in a small town with no memories of your past life. In your quest to find yourself and your purpose, you encounter an evil organization and stop their plans to uncover the 3 holy relics needed to refactor the world into their own image. Ever since I came out with my second MVP, play the demo on itch.io, I've been meaning to completely overhaul the whole game and make it more efficient and dynamic for future releases. The thing is, I've been taking a break from it as of late. But that ends today, because from this point on, I want to start giving you guys monthly updates on the game's process with the hopes of releasing a demo this year. But before you go, I want to show you all the things I've been working on since the last version. The character is different now, and for anybody that cared, originally the character was supposed to be black, but I just don't know how to make pixel art that well. So when I was making my first 2 MVPs, I decided that spending time trying to learn and make pixel art myself would only hinder me from actually developing the game. And developing the game, even if it wasn't a completed project, was the fastest path towards learning more about game development. So I bought mostly all of my sprites from these pixel artists and decided to use the most similar looking ones for my male and female sprites. But there was no way these were ever going to be the final designs, and thankfully, I was able to change them. One of the creators, GIF not GIF, actually made a sprite template sheet that would empower me to create my own sprites without having to go through the process of studying and constructing the body myself from scratch. So after doing a little bit of research on pixel artists and their tips and tricks, I managed to modify the template sheet to create the real main characters for my game. Personally, I like the character designs a lot, and I think it falls more in line for what I envisioned the characters to actually look like in the first place. There's still a list of other characters that are going to need a sprite change as well, but I haven't fully gotten to those characters yet, so we're moving on. The map for the game is also different. I think my skills in generating maps could still use some work, but the scenes now have more depth by constructing the tiles in different layers, adding lighting effects, and creating everything at a relatively decent size. In previous versions of the game, you could walk around and get pretty bored pretty quickly because everything was so spread out, and yet there was very little to do. I've tried keeping those design elements in mind when making the new game maps. Most scenes are not large, and when they are, they have a lot more going on to keep the player interested / invested in navigating the world around them. Another thing I did was learn the proper way to generate collision boxes for my environment. In the past, I would just add box colliders for every corner or create a polygon collider that would surround certain objects and borders in the map. The problem with this was that A, it took too long to do, and B, it left me with very inconsistent colliders that, for me at least, were very noticeable and irritating. Now I use composite colliders, and this pretty much standardizes every single background object in a game that requires a fraction of the time and effort. Besides the background objects in the game that you collide into, there are also objects in the game that you can interact with. For these objects, I made them glow whenever you bump into them as an indicator that they are interactable. In the past, the E button would appear above an object to let you know you could interact with it. But in the future, there will be cases where players bind their controls to something other than the E button on their keyboard, so it made more sense to have a completely new indicator for when it's possible to interact with an object. Another thing that's gotten an improvement was the NPC companion feature. NPC companions will play an important part of the story, so I wanted to make sure that part of the gaming experience looked more polished than how it did in previous versions. In version 1.02, the NPC companions would always jitter and lag behind the player. This is mainly because the player doesn't actually have tile-based movement, but pixel-based movement. As a result of this style, the NPCs that would follow the player would also have to take this pixel-based movement into account, and the calculations for how I did that were always off. So instead of playing with the pixel-based movement style for my NPCs, I decided to just have them travel to the player via linear interpolation instead. It's a different approach for sure, but one that I think still looks better than how they traveled before. And of course, there are some quality of life changes to the game I added as well, such as the UI designs and animations, as well as the camera tracking feature. So that's all I got for you guys today. If there was any topic that you guys wanted more information on, I've got some links in the description that helped me get started on implementing these features. Of course, none of this is perfect, nor are any of these completely set in stone. But if you want to show your support, feel free to playtest the previous version of Guardians of RPG and let me know what features you want to see added or improved. And with that being said, I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace. What's good, y'all? This is SA, and last month I talked about all the updates I've made so far in my indie game, Guardians of RPG. Playtest the previous version on itch.io. And I promised I'll give you all some new updates every month after that. So, for the month of June, I'll be going over the 3 key things that I've worked on thus far. The dialogue system has gotten a huge update. The way I made my dialogue system in the past was by following this Bracky's tutorial on YouTube. In the video, he pretty much creates a dialogue system using the singleton pattern that takes a string value through the inspector and displays the text one character at a time. This is actually fine. However, there were at least 2 things that I wanted to upgrade before finishing versions 1.03. The first thing is the fact that the text information is in the inspector. There isn't technically anything wrong with this, especially if you're creating a smaller game. But when you have a large dialogue-heavy game, having a lot of game components and variables in the inspector may slow down your computer, and it's better to optimize your game so that it's able to be enjoyed on gaming PCs and regular laptops too. So instead of using my inspector to create my dialogue, I now use something known as Ink. Ink is essentially a narrative scripting language for games that you can actually get in Unity for free. With Ink, you can write an entire dialogue story complete with choices and branching paths all inside of one file. You can also store variables to affect and update the dialogue in real time. I personally use this for things like the player's name, as well as determining which type of text boxes needed to be displayed after each line of dialogue. The best part of it all is, despite how seemingly powerful this tool is, each file is probably about 1 kilobyte apiece. So if optimization and storage is something you really care about for your game, using Ink to replace writing the dialogue in the inspector could be something to consider. Another problem I ran into was how the letters in the text box would be displayed. The letters in the text box are displayed one at a time, and since the code didn't know if a word was going to overflow before it typed it, it would start typing out the word in one line and then quickly jump to the next line once it realized it needed more room. This wasn't something I thought was a huge deal when I noticed it, but I do recognize this might seem a bit off-putting to find inside of a more polished game, so I made some adjustments to how the dialogue is displayed in order to fix it. Essentially what I did was type out the text in its entirety, then set the alpha value for everything to 0, and then increment it through each letter in the text. If you want more details on this, I recommend this video here that helped me get through it. The way I create cutscenes have also changed. Cutscenes were one of the most annoying parts of the game to make because it was something that required a lot of work to do, and unless the player goes through multiple runs of the game, they will never get to see all the work that went into creating them. So, the annoying way in which I was making them, coupled with the fact that it may all be for nothing, really limited the number of cutscenes and branching paths I actually put in my game. But I'm able to solve at least one of these issues. To fully explain it, I would need to tell you what I was doing in the past. In Unity, a cutscene can be created by using the timeline feature, and from here, you can link the game object to this timeline by adding a track and make them play certain animation clips and move across the scene. However, every cutscene that would involve a player would mean that when making the scenes, I would need to account for if the player was using the male or female avatar. And the whole time, I was trying to figure out how to switch animation clips on one animation track once a game had already started in order for the cutscenes to reflect the avatar that the player chose. And I just couldn't do it. So instead, I ended up just duplicating the timelines, switching the animation clips manually, and then using a condition statement to determine which version of the timeline to use. This worked out okay, but it also meant that when I needed to change something in one timeline, I would also need to change it in the other timeline. And the more complex my cutscenes were, the more timelines I needed, which only exacerbated the problem. Overall, it was just really inconvenient.
But Shay, why didn't you just add both the male and female tracks into one timeline, and then mute one of them depending on which avatar the player is using?
Because I hadn't thought of that, actually. For anyone left that's just as dumb as me, it turns out you can actually mute certain tracks based on their name and rebuild the graph at runtime following these two methods here. And immediately my problem was solved. Because cutscenes are a lot easier for me to make, and the dialogue system is structured to handle more dynamic scripts of dialogue, I feel better equipped to write a more coherent, plot-driven story for this RPG. Oh yeah, by the way, the story is also changing. A quick backstory on Guardians of RPG. My sophomore year of college had just ended, and I realized that my computer science skills were pretty bad, and I had no work experience. Because of this, it was seemingly impossible for me to get an internship over the summer, which really freaked me out, I'm not gonna lie. So to give myself a bit more of an edge, I decided to learn Java by making a small project of my own. Thus, Guardians of RPG was born, generic title and all. And over time, I was using this project pretty much as a means to further enhance my coding skills with the hopes of eventually being good enough for a job, turning what was once a terminal-based game to a JavaFX game, and from a JavaFX game to a Unity game. But that was kind of the problem, because I wasn't making this game for the story originally. Sure, it had a story, and it was fine, but it was fairly straightforward and a little uninspired, to me at least. So after having a few months to work on the plot, the characters, and the themes, I believe my game has a fully fledged story that people can actually resonate with. Besides, most people are playing role-playing games for the story and to be able to immerse themselves in it. Even if the game didn't look as visually appealing as others, the story would still be the deciding factor of whether or not people truly liked it. So the very last thing that I did for this month was draft dozens of graphs and scripts that will eventually be used to create the actual story for my game. And I hope when it's finally released that you take a liking to it. And that's all I got for you guys today. As usual, if there's any topic that you guys wanted more information on, I've left some links in the description that helped me get started on some of these features. And if you want to show your support, feel free to playtest the previous version of Guardians of RPG and let me know what features you want to see added or improved. And with that being said, I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace. What's good, y'all? This is SA, and this is the third month of my devlog journey making Guardians of RPG. Playtest the previous version on itch.io. And while the last 2 months of game development were going over technical fixes and upgrades like the NPC companions and the dialogue system, this month I want to focus on the aspect of the game that would help with making the game come to life. So for this month, I'll be going over a few features in the game that I think really sets this version apart from the previous ones. I have finally added more custom sprites into the game. In a previous video, I discussed that I had even more custom sprites that I wanted to make in the game, and with the help of one of my friends, I finally got around to making the entire sprite sheet. I was able to send him an example sprite, a template sheet, a color palette, and concept art of the character I needed for the sprite sheet, and he would in turn work on the entire sprite sheet based on the information and tools I gave him. After this, once I was satisfied with the general look of the sprite sheets, I would go in and make minor adjustments to the sprites because sending someone to do revisions over minor details is pretty tedious, and I wanted to be more involved in the design making process. After the sprite sheets were done, I was able to import the assets into the game and create their individual animation controllers and clips to be used as NPCs. As much as I really enjoyed working on turning my characters into these little pixel drawings, this experience taught me that it was still going to take too much time to make custom sprites for every single NPC in the game. So I decided to make a compromise. I decided that since I wouldn't have time to customize every single NPC in the game, I would only be utilizing and customizing sprites done by GIF for main NPCs, and for non-important NPCs, I would be using the sprites done by Virel. All of my other sprites are done by GIF, so I do want my main characters in the game to follow a similar art style if I can help it. This includes NPCs that will act as NPC companions, NPCs that will be involved in major cutscenes, and NPCs that you'll have to fight. As for any other NPC, aka the ones that you randomly talk to inside and outside buildings, they'll have the Virel sprites, at least for now, just because it's way too much work to try to make custom sprites to fill up an entire town or an entire building, and I believe Virel already has a bunch of good sprites that has an art style that's relatively close to what I'm looking for. In addition to this, I also reworked the text boxes for the NPCs, so that talking to main NPCs will bring up their name tag when they're speaking, but for regular NPCs, they won't have a name tag at all. So I think the art style between the two types of NPCs, along with the text box, will act as a sort of visual cue to help players know when they're going to be encountering a regular NPC or a main NPC. But with these changes in mind, I ended up filling up all the scenes in Tiro Town with NPCs. Adding NPCs to the game is always a tedious task, even when you're using prefabs to help with the process, because for each NPC you have to customize pretty much everything so that you can sell the idea that it's a lived-in world. You have to customize the sprites that will be used in every scene, you have to adjust the walk cycles for certain NPCs, you have to account for if the NPC should turn and face the player when the player is interacting with them, and you have to create every single dialogue file for every single NPC. It's not difficult work for sure, but it can definitely be repetitive and can take a while to complete if you have a bunch of NPCs in the game. But like I mentioned before, I think it makes the world feel a lot more lived in, and when it comes to top-down pixel RPGs, it can be a nice way to keep people invested in your game and your story. Speaking of making the world feel more lived in, I've updated the book feature in the game as well. The books themselves were really just text that helped expound on the world itself in terms of science, history, politics, and culture. In previous versions of Guardians of RPG, you were able to walk up to any bookshelf, and from there, you would get to read one of the many tiny fictional excerpts in the game. And because you only read the books in parts, you would have to seek out the other bookshelves throughout the game in order to complete reading a single book. In this version, you still activate the book feature the same way, but this time, the game gives you the option of whether or not you want to continue reading. I was able to make this change in part due to upgrading my dialogue system to ink, which makes adding decisions to the game much easier. But I also think this is a good change because it allows for me to do a couple of things. The first thing is that someone who clicked on the bookshelf on accident or stumbled onto the wrong book are no longer trapped into waiting for the dialogue text to be over. And this can encourage people to check out all of the bookshelves to see if it's something that they're interested in reading. The second thing is that it allows me to put more into a particular piece of text. If one bookshelf is going to contain chapter 1 of a book, I want to be able to add all the information for chapter 1, but still give readers the opportunity to stop at different points. Essentially, it allows me to add more into these books while encouraging people to read more of these books now that there's no pressure of waiting until all the dialogue is done. I know for some people, they don't really care about reading all the text or talking to all of the NPCs in the game, but I personally really enjoy doing that. I think that's why RPGs are kind of my favorite games, because it allows me to immerse myself in a way that other games that aren't interested in lore simply don't. And now that I reworked my story from the previous version, I'm excited to show some of you what I have in store for Guardians of RPG. Finally, I've added a day and night cycle to the game. There are certain actions and events that can only take place during certain parts of the day or a few times a day. So having a day and night cycle is foundational to ensuring these branching features will also work smoothly. One of the features to this is getting water at the local well in Tiro Town. This feature allows you to get 1 bucket of water per day that you can use to heal yourself in and out of battle. The other feature that acts this way is the medical center. Usually medical centers will heal you all the time, no questions asked, but for this particular medical center, they limit the amount of times you can be healed to only a few times per day. The reason for this is explained in the story, but for now, it means you'll have to rely on other methods to heal yourself, train, and progress throughout the game, which I think will help make this RPG feel more immersive than previous versions. Whenever I was watching people playtest the game, even though it looked like they were enjoying themselves, there weren't that many unique ways to play, which contributed to the gameplay feeling very linear. And I mean, it is kind of linear in the sense that it's a story with a set ending, but I still do want players to come out of the game with a unique experience. And I think incorporating the new NPCs, books, and the day and night cycle features will all contribute to this. So that's all I got for you guys today. As usual, if there are any topics that you guys wanted more information on, I've left some links in the description that help me get started on some of these features. And if you want to show your support, feel free to playtest the previous version of Guardians of RPG and let me know what features you want to see added or improved. And with that being said, I'll see y'all later. Peace. What's good, y'all? This is SA, and this is month 4 of devlogging my indie game, Guardians of RPG, where so far we've made improvements to and added new game features to the project. Check out the previous videos if you want to learn more. But this time, I wanted to focus on adding a few features that should have been added to versions 1.02. These features would have helped with exploration, but were eventually cut due to a limited amount of time. The wild grass feature and the map feature. If you ever played Pokemon or any similar RPG games, you know the importance of having a wild encounter feature in general. One of the ways my players will gain experience is through battle, and if you go most of your journey not fighting random encounters, you may face mandatory enemies in the story that you're unprepared to defeat, whether it's due to the lack of stats or the lack of resources. Wild encounters give you the opportunity to gain experience through battle, learn more of the battle mechanics, and obtain item drops after defeating a wild enemy. In short, having a wild encounter feature generally makes progression in the game easier. In previous versions of my game, not having these features made it either really difficult or very one-dimensional. Versions 1.01 had an extremely hard boss fight where you were fighting 3 enemies at once, and versions 1.02 adjusted it so where the fight felt super easy. A wild encounter feature in my own game will allow me to set a range of difficulty for enemies, with the hopes that if progressing through the game naturally isn't enough to defeat them, they can use these features as a way to catch up. But to make wild encounters work, I needed to add the wild grass. So let me show you how I did it. GIF has 2 bush sprites, one that acts as the background sprite, and the other that acts as the foreground sprite. So one would imagine all you would have to do is place all the sprites in their own layer. The background grass on layer 1, the player on layer 2, and the foreground grass on layer 3, right? Well, everything would look fine if you were walking left and right through the field, but once you traveled up and down through the field, you could see some inconsistencies in this approach. The problem is, when moving from one bush to another, I still need to find a way to have the lower section of each bush not obscure the sprite's face. One devlog video I was looking into resolved this issue by splitting up their sprite's character into multiple parts, after which they were able to place different parts of the sprites in different layers. This solution allowed them to customize their sprites in many different ways, but I'm not even gonna lie to you, I'm not doing all that. And thankfully, I didn't have to. Unity has this component you can add to your game object called a mask, and this allows you to cover up a range of layers and sorting orders inside or outside the mask's barrier. Using this, I was able to create a mask on the player's sprite face and customize this mask to allow the face to be shown while the bottom grass layer remained covered. This still gives the impression that the grass is tall enough to cover the player's legs without any of the weird layering issues. After sorting these layers, there was still something I needed to do in order to make the grass feature really pop, and that was to add animation. If you've played any games that allow you to explore grassy areas, you'd see that the animation is what really helps sell the idea that the player is actually walking through grass. And there are many ways in which devs do this. One way would have been to animate each patch of grass that the player goes through. But I decided to take the old school approach and animate the grass effects every time the player steps into a patch of grass. When getting a feel on how to animate the actual grass effects, I took inspiration from Pokemon Fire Red to see how they animated their own sprites. Then when animating the grass effects myself, I experimented with how many frames I wanted until I was comfortable with how it looked. Then I wrote up a simple program that played the grass sprite whenever the player was moving in the grass and stopped the animation whenever that was not the case. It's still not perfect, and it has its moments that would require a bit more refining, but I decided it looked good enough to stop for now, program the wild encounter code, and move on to the next feature in the game, the maps. So, the last thing I did for this update was add a map for the player to use. Not only will your player be traveling around the world, but other characters, books, and the story itself will reference different locations and places. Having a map will allow you as the player to understand the world you occupy and to see where you are relative to the world around you. Truth be told, I actually designed a map for this game years ago, but I just never got around to actually designing it in-game. But using GIF's overworld sprites, I thankfully didn't have to do every single thing from scratch, though figuring out how to translate the sketch to the game was still very challenging. I'll spare you the details, but it took a lot of time layering the different sprites, such as the deep waters from the shallow waters, landmass, textures, trees, houses. I mean, you get the point. You can see in the map itself that there are still some places that could still use a bit more work. But once all of this was done, the next part was creating a UI for the map that would allow the player to not only see where they are in relation to the world, but also allow them to see more details about certain places and locations. The way the map works is pretty straightforward. Clicking on the map icon, the icon I created myself by the way, would open up the map scene. At this point, you should be able to see not only the entire map of RPG, but also where you are in the map with the cursor sprite. The buttons that are associated with each location would be the triggers that allow you to zoom into each spot in the map and get an even more detailed look and description of the location in question. Then you would click the back button to see the entire world once more, and click the back button again to exit the map. Right now, the demo will just take place in Tiro Town, but in the future, this map could be used to include new features like hidden locations or fast travel. So I thought it would be a nice touch to implement this feature in the game early for versions 1.03. And that's all I got for you guys today. As usual, if there was any topics that you guys wanted more information on, I've left some links in the description that helped me get started on some of these features. I know this month didn't have too many updates, but that's because I'm gearing up to talk about some more complicated mechanics in the upcoming months towards the year's end. So be sure to stick around if you want to see more of that. And if you want to show your support, feel free to playtest previous versions of Guardians of RPG and let me know what features you want to see added or improved. And with that being said, I'll see y'all later. Peace. What's good, y'all? This is SA, and this is month 5 of my devlog series, Guardians of RPG. And over the last few months, we've developed some really good features that already sets this version apart from the previous ones. New player and NPC sprites, a better NPC tracking feature, a better UI, a better dialogue mechanic, a day and night cycle, tall grass and a wild encounter feature, and an actual map for this sprawling epic. These are all good changes, but if we're being real, none of these features are as important as the one I'm going to be talking about today, the battle system. So in part 1 of this video, I'm going over the mechanics of the battle system in relative detail, how it works, the changes, and what I did or plan to do to make those changes. So let's just jump into it. The old battle system was, okay, it was pretty mid, and to be fair, that was kind of by design. The previous versions of Guardians of RPG are what we in the community would like to call a minimum viable product, or MVP. Basically, I was just getting started in my Unity game development journey, and in order to stop myself from spending too much time trying to make the game perfect, I instead would spend that time distilling my game into its basic components and forcing myself to learn as much as Unity as I could within a 6-month time frame. And so while it did help a lot in learning about game development and forcing me to narrow my vision for Guardians of RPG, it did naturally leave a lot on the cutting room floor, a lot of which being battle related. Here's what I mean. Most of the moves I made were either pretty worthless or overpowered. Now, of course, if you're playing an RPG, the moves that you learn in the beginning of the game will eventually become obsolete the more powerful and complex your enemies become. But in my game, most moves that you learn even later into the MVP were simply not worth using for one simple reason. The moves weren't balanced at all. In the case of the swordsman class, there's a few moves that you learn in the game that are fairly decent when you're starting out. Moves like cut, dice, cross chop, slice, all pretty generic moves with very little fanfare. Actually, now that I'm reading these names out loud, some of these moves were also just way too generic as well. Like they were just different names for the same thing. But anyways, you would have these generic moves where the purpose was just to deal X amount of damage to a character. And then all of a sudden, your player would learn a move like air slash, which is still a pretty generic name, but it has a lot more going for it compared to the others. For one, air slash has a priority of 2, which means it's one of the few moves that allow you to go before regular moves. In addition to that, priority moves also have a chance to make the opponent flinch, which gets smaller and smaller the more times you use it. The logic behind it was that priority moves are meant to catch your opponent by surprise, being performed regardless of how fast the opponent is in comparison. But the more times you use it, the less likely they're going to be surprised by the technique. Regardless of the logic behind it, air slash was a move that did a pretty good chunk of damage, had priority, had the ability to make opponents flinch, and you learned the move at like level 15. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. But at least when it came to moves like air slash, you would run out of elixir points or EP for that move and be forced to use something else. The thing is, all of the other moves were pretty worthless in comparison. For example, there's a move called Buster, which has a base power that is less than cut, but in return, it reduces the defense of the opponent by 5%. If you don't see the problem with this right away, I'll tell you right now, it has to do with the 5% defense reduction. To put it in perspective, let's say your opponent has a defensive stat of 5. In my game, lowering the defense by 5% would be taking it down to 0.25, which would get rounded up to 1, leaving your opponent with a defense of 4. The debuff is already inconsequential in this scenario, but the higher level your opponents are, the higher their defense stat will be, which will make using a move like Buster even worse. So if you have moves that are completely worthless and moves that are completely overpowered, it's going to force people to play the game the exact same way, which is the opposite of what I want. I want people to have as much of a varied experience playing this game as possible because I personally really value the replayability that comes with RPGs and video games in general. So after doing some preliminary research on fighting moves and turn-based games, I decided to structure my moves in this way. Change number 1, moves with stat buffs and debuffs will no longer operate by percentages in a traditional sense, but instead by stages. Stages have a predetermined multiplier assigned to them that factor into a character's stats. There are about 13 stages ranging from 6 all the way to -6, and the progression between each stage strikes a balance between having a noticeable change without being overpowered. Change number 2, all priority moves are getting a damage nerf. There are 3 types of priority moves, each with their own levels of priority and flinch rate. The way it will be set up is the higher the priority, the higher the flinch rate, but the lower the actual base attack will be. It should make these moves still viable to use, but now priority moves will no longer be the meta-defining playstyle since it's not overpowered and leaves room for counterplay. Change number 3, more status conditions are getting added to the game. When making the game, I think I implemented like 4 status conditions, and a lot of those conditions were locked behind moves that required you to be a really high level anyway, which means that most players wouldn't even get a chance to use them in the MVPs. And again, this is one of those things that made fighting in the game feel very linear because there just weren't that many good options or strategies you could use to play the game. So not only am I adding new moves, I'm also adding new status conditions to the game to encourage different ways to play. I first started by adding most of the typical status conditions that you see in Pokemon: burn, confusion, freeze, paralysis, poison, and sleep. And most of you pretty much know how those work already, but I also added a few more status conditions that are inspired from D&D. And these status conditions are blindness, a condition that halves the accuracy and evasion of the character; charm, this acts similarly to infatuation from Pokemon; deafen, a condition that cuts the character's evasion stat by 75%; exhaustion, which has a myriad of effects depending on which level of exhaustion a player is in, ranging from disadvantage on rolls to an automatic knockout; frighten, a condition that impacts your roll advantage state, which makes it harder to block attacks, perform crits, or escape battle; petrification, a condition that freezes you in place for a maximum of 3 rounds; and restrain, a condition that reduces the character's speed to 0, making them always go last for a maximum of 2 rounds. I know some of these conditions seem really busted on paper. Petrification, I'm looking at you, but I'm still in the process of testing them out, so they are still subject to change. Overall, I believe having these status conditions will help give the game a few more dimensions and actually challenge people when they're fighting different opponents. And lastly, change number 4, the elixir points mechanics are getting a rework. Elixir points worked in the same way as power points from Pokemon, in the sense that you had a maximum amount of times you could use a move before you no longer could do it anymore. The thing is, Elixir in my game is more akin to Chakra and Nen from Naruto and Hunter x Hunter respectively. Elixir is a life force that each character has that allows them to perform certain techniques based on their archetype. Each technique requires a certain amount of elixir points to use, and if you try to perform a technique without enough elixir, it comes at the expense of your HP. Oh yeah, and of course, your elixir points would recharge by a certain amount each round. And that's pretty much the bare bones of it. If you want to learn more about elixir, play the game when it comes out. Yeah. The reasoning behind changing this was because this is how it was always supposed to work. I just never had the time to actually make a good elixir point mechanic when I was working on my MVPs. But even more so, I think it's a nice way to balance out powerful moves in the game. By making them cost a lot of EP, it prevents the character from being able to spam the same technique over and over again, which means characters and the players will have to be a lot more strategic with how they play. By the way, if you're new here, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. EO Comics is independently run by, well, me, where I basically make things from video games, comic books, and even animations, and it would mean a lot if you could show your support by leaving a like, a comment, or even subscribing. Anyway, the moves I created were only one part of what made this game a little lacking, which brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, the actual battle system. Now see, the battle system in theory wasn't actually bad. It followed a pretty simple flow. It asks you what you want to do, arranges the order of characters based on their selections, and each character would perform their actions that they chose, repeating the cycle until all the enemies or allies are knocked out. And like I said, this wasn't bad. I mean, it was simple, but not bad. The problem lies in the fact that I was a pretty crappy coder, like full stop. I mean, the way a typical programmer works is when they uncover a problem, they come up with a solution, and then once that solution works, they iterate on the code so that it's dynamic, readable, but most importantly, it covers most, if not all, related edge cases. The thing is, when working on the battle system, and most of the game for that matter, my code could barely meet all 3 of these criteria, and this only caused even more problems that became even harder to debug as the development process went on. But I'm currently working on refactoring how I code the battle system by implementing the state design pattern. Essentially, the state design pattern is a way to restrict the behavior on an object depending on which state it's in inside of a finite state machine. And a finite state machine is just a computation machine that inhabits one state at a time through a series of triggers with a start and an end state. By having the code follow a state design pattern, I can organize my battle system through different states and more easily determine where my bugs are coming from. So, after deciding on using the state design pattern, I got to work converting my ideas for the new battle system into a finite state machine, and it looks like this. Let me show you how it works. The initialized state basically sets up everything for the battle system. from the backgrounds, the characters, the camera, etc. The option state is a state that allows you to choose one of several options after everything has been initialized, whether it's a move or technique, an item, or simply to just run. After choosing your options, you'll either go through two states, roll for initiative state or the roll to run state. Rolling for initiative is a D&D mechanic that determines who gets to go first in battle regardless of speed or priority moves. This can only be done for like a maximum of 3 times. Roll to run is a state that takes your roll advantage into account when determining if you're able to escape the battle. Once these things are taken into account and the order of operations are placed, the battle system will then enter the character action state, which displays the character's actions. Next, the action effect state will display the effect of said character action. If a character is knocked out, it will enter the character KO state, and if a battle is over, it will enter the battle over state. There are a few more states that I want to include, but for now, these are the ones that I'm adding to make the game flow in a way that's easier for me to code while still remaining engaging. And that's all I got for you guys today. As usual, if there are any topics you guys wanted more information on, I've left some links in the description that help me get started on some of these features. There was a lot to cover for this devlog, and I tried to condense it to its bare bones as much as possible, but if you have any suggestions for these mechanics or if you have any questions about them, feel free to let me know in the comments. I do try to make sure I react or respond to every single one because, to be honest, there isn't a lot, so please comment. I do see them. And if you want to show your support, feel free to playtest the previous versions of Guardians of RPG and let me know what features you want to see added or improved. And with that being said, I'll see y'all later. Peace. What's good, y'all? This is SA, and in my last devlog video, I explained the new mechanics of the battle system and how it worked. In this update, I wanted to let you know that I finally implemented a majority of those changes. So now you get a chance to see how they look in-game, and I'll have a better opportunity to go more in depth on some of the mechanics that require a little more explaining. So after I make sure you subscribe to the channel, we can finally jump into it. Alright, let's go. In my previous video, I threw a lot of new status conditions at you and only briefly got to go over them. In that rushed explanation, I forgot to mention the key thing that separates some status conditions from others, which is the fact that most of them can stack onto each other. The idea was that it would make the game more challenging and realistic if you had to look out for multiple status conditions at once, or if you created strategies where you could inflict multiple status conditions on your enemies. Of course, not all the status conditions stack, and besides what the main status conditions do, this is the second biggest distinction between them and what helps keep them balanced. For example, you can stack burn on top of poison, but you can't stack burn on top of freeze. You can stack freeze on top of exhaustion, but you can't stack freeze on top of petrification. And when you do petrify someone, it removes all the other status conditions the target may have and replaces it with just petrification. If you're curious about the full list, here's all the status conditions and what they stack with. I personally think this helps keep certain status conditions from being overwhelmingly broken. For example, while you can't break out of petrification, at least you can't be inflicted with any other status conditions. But if you're inflicted with sleep, while you do have the opportunity to wake up each round, you can still be inflicted with other status conditions like burn and poison. So that's how status conditions work. Moving on to the next mechanic. In the previous devlog, I mentioned how using a technique in the game will cost elixir to use, and if you run out of elixir and try to perform a move, then it comes at the expense of your health. And while all of this is still true, it does beg the question, what do you do if you want to perform an attack, but you don't have any elixir at all? That's where the concepts of basic attacks come in. Basic attacks are attacks that require no elixir to use, and they have no added effects either. Think of attacks that cost elixir as a Rasengan, and basic attacks as just people throwing hands. So you're probably thinking, if there's an option where I can attack without needing elixir, why not just use that instead of my normal attacks? Well, let's compare the basic attack with a technique that has the same base power. The base attack did 1 HP worth of damage, while the technique did 3 HP worth of damage. Why is that? Well, the secret lies in how the different attacks are calculated in the game. While both calculate your attacks by the base power, techniques additionally add multipliers for if the technique they're performing is of the same class or archetype as them. This not only makes techniques, generally speaking, more powerful to use than regular attacks, but it creates opportunities for you to switch between using a technique and a basic attack. Whatever strategy you use, I think this is a much more thrilling way to play compared to how the battle system used to work. In addition to that, I've added one more feature to the game that helps make the battles more interesting. In the previous version, whenever a character would throw out a move, it would look like this. And that was always boring to me. So I'm adding animations to my moves to make the game more entertaining to play. The sprite sheets where I got these animations from is from a pixel artist named Pimen, who has attack animations for literally anything you want, which was super helpful. It meant that all I needed to do was create the animation timeline using the sprite sheets and call the animation whenever the move was being used. The only problem I have now is that there are over 151 moves to animate now. Am I going to animate all the moves in time for the demo? No, I love myself too much to go through all that stress. But I have animated a few techniques to use and coded it to where everything else will have 1 or 2 animations to save some time. In the future, I will animate all the other moves, but in order to finish this demo, I gotta move on to adding cutscenes and other quality of life changes. And that's all I got for you guys today. If there are any questions you have on this, I've left some links in the description that help me get started on some of these features. Special thanks to Pimen for the animation effects, and to Egg for the wild animal sprites. The link to get in touch with them for any commissions or to buy their works will also be in the description. Like I mentioned already, the next devlog video will be going over cutscenes and other miscellaneous changes for the first chapter of Guardians of RPG. So make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, or else, and yeah, I'll see y'all later. Peace.